So, hello everybody. Welcome to the Iowa Remote. I'm very happy to announce a very special guest today. Yes, you will all know him from the Draftsmen podcast, I guess. The host, Marshall Vandruff. Draftsman will be known to you. It's a podcast hosted by Marshall and Stan Prokopenko. He's also one of the mostly searched for instructors, art instructors, and I had the big pleasure already to participate in some of his courses, and I highly recommend them to you. Yes, and to his students there belong the giants of the craft like Vance Kovich, and I'm very happy and proud to welcome and introduce to you Mr. Marshall Vandruff.
Hi, everybody. I am Marshall Vandruff, and I am going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Can you see the screen that says strategies to improve your creativity with me?
Yes.
And I think I got the date correct because I'm here in the morning in Southern California, and you are there in the late afternoon or early evening in all parts of the world, but most of you are in Germany. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Well,
most of our guests are from Germany.
Okay. You could be doing all sorts of other things this evening, and you are here with me. I am here, as you know, by the invitation of Christian, and he told me that a number of you already knew who I was from the Draftsmen podcast, which I will refer to today tirelessly as if I were promoting it, which I'm not because it's old news. But for 3 years, I did most of my teaching on that podcast. We did 108 episodes. I got a little tired of it. Then Stan replaced me with Jeff Watts. People loved it. So instead of being on a weekly podcast, I'm now here with you and happy. Thank you, Christian. I know Christian from classes and correspondence, and when he asked me to spend a session with you, the first topics that came up were composition and creativity. So I will summarize lessons from my composition course, which one of you I saw in the chat asked whether I'm going to do them on European time. I've tried to make these so that the courses so that they happen at noon here, or they happen at 8. Sometimes I've even done at 10 p.m. so that people around the world can do it. But I'm working on that. We're going to call this right now. We've got our sessions in sync, so our 2 hours today we'll make the best of. I'll try to summarize some lessons from the composition course, but that will introduce the most important thing about a composition course, which is that composition is not about following rules or formula. Composition, by definition, has to be coming up with, composing, ideating, creative work. I will elaborate on this, but I wanted to give us a little better placard. Strategies to improve your creativity, and with one of my favorite artists in there who I'll refer to a number of times, but I did composite, which may be absolutely sacrilegious to take his work and put two pieces together. We're calling this strategies, and a number of these lessons will come from my composition course. We have quite a few questions from you. I'll try to get to almost all of them. Most of them are about these two topics, composition and creativity, or I should say creativity and picture making. Now, brace your eyes. You've got a dark slide in front of you, and if you are in a dark room and it suddenly goes to bright daylight like this, it can hurt. Here are a dozen or so categories that artists, picture makers specifically, care about. Any one of them can take a lot of time to master. I threw in apps for a reason. Learning an app like Maya or Blender or Unreal Engine is not a quick task. Some who are expert with their apps are not at all good at coming up with ideas. Some who are expert at coming up with good ideas are not technically skilled in apps or perspective or any one of a number of these other things that are up here. I include genre because I've been teaching a genre class for a few terms, and we find out that some people can do humor, but they can't do horror, or vice versa. I suppose that mastering a genre is related to creating a mood. But if you make your own list like this of the things you hope to master, they will include some of these and others not. Some that will be only on your list. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment in case you want to think about that, or in case you're making notes and you're saying, yeah, I am not interested in 2 or 3 of those things, but there's a couple up there that aren't up there that I want on there. And then I'm going to show you why I'm giving you this slide full of randomly distributed picture making skills. I think that for picture making, we can boil all those up there and more down into 3 big categories. I don't want to take credit for these 3 big categories because it was 35 years ago that Drew Struzan, the movie poster illustrator who gave me time, explained to me that there were 3 big categories of skill and that I had skill in one and not so much in another and not at all in the third. Let's take them from the order of the most obvious one. The first one I'm going to call technique. Now, when I use the English word technique, it may have a number of connotations to you. Take a moment to write down or make a note in your mind what you think it means, because it has more than one meaning in English. Starting with this because it's the thing that everybody knows when they learn to make pictures. You can't make a picture until you have some instrument or medium or way of applying it. And technique can mean the method you use to do a job. That's the big meaning. This is a more specific meaning, and it is how the artist applies the medium. There's pen and ink technique. There's watercolor technique, oil painting technique. When digital came in, Photoshop's brushes sucked. There was a company, there was an app called Painter that had very good brushes, but was a difficult, problematic program. And now there's so many apps that have marvelous brushes. So even when we get digital tools, we start being concerned with technique, how the mark goes down. Now, rather than just have words up here, let's go back 500 years to an example. If that were done in the 20th century, it would be pen and ink technique. If it were done in the 21st century, it would be digital brushes in Procreate, or markers in Procreate. Most of Dürer's work that got so famous is done by cutting into wood and making a print from the wood. Woodcuts. Printing was happening. You could make a picture and print it. It could go out to thousands of people. It's hard not to get distracted by what an interesting image it is, but all I want you to see is that he did it with lines, black and white. As he did that, and the same artist did this, which is certainly not pen and ink. It's oil paint. Same artist, same skills, different medium, different technique, smooth gradations, extremely realistic, before anybody had ever seen a photograph. Now, I'm isolating technique because when you learn art, you typically learn a technique. When I was 19 or 20 years old, we had an assignment in our college class to do a technical illustration, and I loved Maxell cassettes for some reason. So I took apart an audio cassette, and with an airbrush and transparent dyes, I did that. I was proud of it. My dad was proud of it. It was really hard to do because I couldn't paint the tape and then spray a light bit of opaque paint over it like I would have done later when I had some brains about how to go about this. I had to do this with transparent dye sprayed through the airbrush, which means I had to plan how light or dark every little bit on here would be. And it took forever. But I had a portfolio piece. And it got me work. And by the time I started getting work, this was one of my early jobs for a client that paid me enough money to where my dad said, "Really? You got paid that much money for that?" It was 750 American US dollars. And yeah. So I got to do it at home. It's done with acrylic paint so that when they changed what happened in here, I could put white gesso over it and then paint over the top of that and fix it because it was now opaque and not transparent. Some brains about technique now. And one thing led to another. I actually had the device so I could take it apart and look at how it worked. And this was my first really big job for Schlage locks, an inset door lock. And it was for a big ad agency, and they gave me the lock, which was covered with grease, and it was just a mess. But I took a photograph of it, redrew it from the photograph, and then painted it. I didn't know anything about perspective. I was in my early 20s, mid-20s. I knew nothing about perspective by that time, but I did know how to handle an airbrush, and I knew how to make gradations. And so what they were paying me for was to make it look shiny and make it look transparent. Now, good thing, I made my living with technique. There was a famous technical illustrator who couldn't do a job And so they were going to give the job to me at the agency, and I wanted to meet with the illustrator to see how he worked. And he looked at my portfolio, and it was an airplane that I had done. He said, I can see how you got a flashy technique, and I can see how if you and I were up for a job, same job, they might choose you over me, but I also can see you don't know what you're doing, and it pisses me off. So that was one of my first bits of humbling from an old illustrator who knew perspective and form and machines, letting me know I didn't know what I was doing. He was right. But I'm not done with this story. What I want you to see is that by 1994, this was in the 80s, by 1992, 93, I was in a store. Somebody showed me on a computer in a store, they were trying to sell the computer, what you could do with Photoshop. And they made a gradation with a tool that made this perfect gradation in an instant and said, if you don't like it, hit a couple buttons and it undid it. And you could change the colors and change how it gradated. And I almost hyperventilated in public. I couldn't believe that all this work I'd done by spraying paint through an airbrush was changing. And there were things like this, advertisements. Turn your images, that means your photograph, into art automatically. Push a button and the computer takes care of the technique in 1,000 ways. You're obsolete. You don't need to do all of that airbrush stuff. One of my students did portraits. This is me, by the way. That's me in my youth when I still had a little hair up there, teaching animal drawing. These were Tamara's 6 teachers from the art school. And I said, how did you do those? And she said, it's software online where you can put in a few things and make it so that it looks like the person. And in an instant, it creates it. All right, technique, how the artist applies the medium. It has changed dramatically. And I recognized somewhere in there that I was going to need to change. And we'll take the next one up, which is draftsmanship. This is one that when people try to define it, they can run into trouble because it's got a lot of connotations that don't necessarily help. I'm going to start with a definition that we'll tear apart in a moment. Correct drawing. Some people don't like the term correct drawing. And I understand why. Because some great drafts people are not that concerned with correctness. They do care, but they are willing to sacrifice it for something else. So we could use another term, illusory drawing. Draftsmanship or draftspersonship is to create on a flat surface the illusion of a much different world than that flat surface, a world of three-dimensionality, a world of sophisticated scientific development to make it so that it looks like there's the illusion of a real world in there. But the word illusory is a little tough. I'm going to settle on another inadequate word, representational drawing. It's not absolutely correct because cartoons, including very flat cartoons, children's books, where there's practically no perspective, are still representational as opposed to abstract. But we'll let this stand for now to make a point, and then I'll give you 3 things that are a part of drafting. One is anatomy. If a person does not know what a thing is made of, they cannot master that aspect of the painting. This is human anatomy and animal anatomy and automobile anatomy and tree anatomy and architectural anatomy and the anatomy of folds in drapery. There's an argument to be made for naivety. If you don't know what the anatomy is, just do the naive version. There's an argument to be made for naivety, but masterful drafting requires how the machine works, which parts are bone and muscle. It is a part of grown-up, sophisticated, representational, illusory, correct drawing. But it isn't enough, because the surgeon may know anatomy and they cannot draw it anywhere like Michelangelo or even me. Perspective is the next discipline. And perspective is how that three-dimensional thing occupies three-dimensional space and is represented on the two-dimensional surface to say, see this? It looks 3D. I include it as the second component of drafting. Here is the third, and I'll call it the final one, rendering. You see, perspective is not enough. Perspective is like wire frames in a 3D app. You put a skin on it, and that skin may be shiny or matte or dark or light or rough or smooth. And if you light it from the front versus behind, or diffuse lighting versus specular, there's infinite number of ways you can light it, even if there's only 7 or 8 categories. You can light that form to reveal it and its surface. And those 3 components make up drafting. Now, I know I'm loading a lot onto you. I'm trying to keep the pace a little slow in case this is giving you insights. And I will pause for comments or questions after I've finished a whole train of thought. It'll be about another 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to show you examples in a moment. I'll show you an example from the very artist, Albrecht Dürer. What an unimpressive, clunky, awkward, mashed character. But Albrecht did not intend us to see this. This is a study. This is someone who's saying, on this flat surface, this part of the face is facing toward me. This part is facing less toward me. This part is facing even more away from me. It is perspective applied to the architecture of a head. Well, another famous part of the body that is hard to draw, our hands. This was the first masterpiece, apart from Mad Magazine drawings, that I ever copied when I was about 11 or 12 years old, because it was everywhere. Religious people had these on plaques and medallions and everything else. I knew that it was Albrecht Dürer for some reason. I don't know how I did, but I tried copying it. Ignorantly, I was just copying what I saw. But as the years have gone on and I look at what he knew, He knew about fingers, for one thing. He knew their anatomy from the inside out. He also knew about perspective. And as Robert Beverly Hale would point out, there is not a line on there that is not a perspective line. Sorry, I need to get a tool from the toolbox if I can find it. Ah, I found it. The curves that way are a way of telling us that if that were a cylinder, if it were convex, or if it were an egg, and this part was closer to us, I should switch to a color that's going to show up. I'm sorry to delay this, but let's give this a try. If that's an egg and this part's closer, a line around it will curve that way. That's to show that, sorry about the angles. I'm trying to do this on a Wacom tablet. That end is closer. It could have been the other way around. It could have been that this end is closer. And so any curve will curve that way if it's convex. And Dürer's awareness of that phenomenon is evident every line. If he does anything different, it's because he has a reason. But it's not just perspective. It is that he knows that the light is coming from this direction, and it gets these areas and doesn't get to these areas, and he even puts a core shadow and reflected light on these fingers. This is a masterpiece of drafting for anatomy, for perspective, and for rendering, done with lines. It is also a beautiful piece of what we call expressive drawing, that just the choice to make lines like this and lines like this that cross over each other, and then lines that don't cross over each other, and to leave some areas open means that there's a beautiful design to it and a rhythm of which parts are filled in and which parts are. Now, that was some time on those hands. I want to pull back the curtain now and show you the kind of thinking behind it in the training of a German artist or a Swiss German artist or any artist, an artist in Europe, Africa, Australia, the US, Japan, China, anywhere in the 21st century, now that everybody has access to this information. This was the kind of thing that Dürer had to travel to Florence. He had to travel to Italy to get this information. And now it's on the internet. That's the way we learn to draw a hand so that it looks credible. Anatomy broken into specific parts that have hinges or ball and socket joints or swivel joints or plate joints or the other kinds of anatomy issues. Forms, and then where is the light coming from? And that we go from there to the more developed stuff. All right, I'm still on the subject of drafting. I know I'm going slowly. If you need to do yoga or something, I'm not going to speed up. I want to make a point about how this affected me as a picture maker. I learned drafting. I learned perspective by teaching it at the junior college. Nobody wanted to teach it. When I was a student there, people hated perspective. I wanted to learn it. I taught it, and I learned it. And I got to where when a client asked me to do a little pencil drawing, that pencil drawing is not much bigger than a greeting card. My son owns it. That was a week of work. They wanted a surgeon. They wanted dramatic lighting. I didn't have a photograph to copy. I had photographs of surgeons so I could see what they wore and see what their mechanisms were. But I made this up, designed it out in thumbnails, and it's so small that a dime, a small coin would cover that entire part. I loved doing that kind of stuff. And I knew how to make up light on form and rim light and core shadow and then bring it around and do the other. It was by that time, I was a grown-up. I was a professional. And I did tons of this kind of thing. And that is done with an airbrush. There's nothing digital about that. There was tons of preliminary work. Airbrush, masks, ballpoint pen for the little lines, paintbrush. This is something that people advertising agencies, medical equipment agencies paid a lot to do. But I only did that up until 1994 when we switched to digital. And in the mid-1990s, I did the same thing, only now in Photoshop on layers, which was great because I could put that reflection on a layer. That was not done with a 3D program. You can kind of tell it's made up, it's stylized. And there came a point where I got sick of how slick it was. It's personality-less. And so in the early days of digital, I'm bragging. I was one of the kind of pioneers. We were experimenting around with stuff. This was not with paper textures. That was all digital, but I actually took noise in Photoshop, downsampled it, put filters on it, upsampled it, put overlays on it when Photoshop just had layers. They didn't bring layers in until about 1994. And I was trying to make it look more like paper textures. Okay, I made a lot of money doing that kind of thing. By that time, I knew drafting. But what I want you to see is that this is the way the computer thinks. 3D programs, this was way before 3D programs were accessible to normal humans. And things like that were not done in the computer. Things like that was done in the computer, and then an artist had to take a photograph and put it onto a piece of paper and paint the edges to make it fit together. One of you asked, when does it make sense to try new things within a given commission? And when should I stay with the techniques that I can handle securely in an experienced way? My answer is when the stakes are low, experiment. I learned new media, new techniques, and for that matter, perspective, by working on jobs over a period of years, so that I never got a degree to speak of. I got to learn because some jobs let me do it, but it was not all fun and games. When the stakes are high, when there's a lot riding on this, when if you fail, it will damage your reputation, don't try new things in a given commission when failure could mess things up. Now, in the 1990s, 3D took over the world. I knew that it was coming. I knew that my technical illustrations were not going to be done with airbrush anymore, or even in Photoshop. They were going to be done with 3D programs because they were happening. But desktop computers, it was hard. They weren't up for it. But in the late 90s, I got an opportunity to paint a steamroller. And the guy I worked for, Bruce Mayo, who I loved and who trusted me on all sorts of jobs, he took chances on me. He wanted a big, bitchin' looking steamroller for this ad. And I told him I could paint it in Photoshop, but I'm working with some guys who know 3D really well at Interplay, Black Isle Division, and they are innovators with 3D. And so Vance Kovacs and Aaron Brown, who did this all day long, helped me on a 1-week deadline where I lost a lot of sleep over it, but Bruce totally trusted me. And in a week and 2 days, we delivered that. Now, that may not be impressive to you in today's world, but in the late 90s, when people did not have 3D programs on their desktops, we got this texture through grueling difficulty. We scanned in wood grain, and we used it as a bump map. And we assigned reflectivity and gloss and other qualities that 3D programs, Lightwave isn't even being used anymore. But that was cutting edge technology for some people in the 90s. And it looked too chrome. And when you wanted to render a little area, when you wanted to take an area like that and render it, you had to select a little patch of it, hit a button, and go for a walk for 45 minutes while it rendered that little area. And then you say, it's too shiny, too shiny. And you did this over and over and over. Vance built these lights from the inside out. It was just incredible. And I knew a little about it, but I was not the one solving most of these problems. I was learning. But we did it. Bruce trusted me. The stakes were high. It came through. So I have another thing I want to add. When the stakes are high, don't, or seek help from friends. If you've got people around you who are experienced and they can do something like that. If no friends, pray. I'm just going to leave you with that. I'm going to have to turn you over to the supernatural. Now, I hope I answered your question. That was the result, not of my talent. That was the result of a trusting art director, good relationships with people who I knew better, who I knew could do better than I could do. And we pulled it off. We pulled it off. And he paid me okay for it. We shared favors on that. And I licensed it to a number of people later. It sold more. Actually, I made much more money on this for people who licensed the rights to it than I did for doing it. Now, I was aware, though, 3D is going to change everything. Did more jobs in 3D, but you know how I rebounded? I rebounded right around these years, right after this job. I rebounded by keeping a sketchbook, and I went ballistic back into graphite to do this kind of thing. I did hundreds of pages like these. It was part of my midlife crisis. And you can see, these are not commercial. These were not for clients. They took drafting. There's technique. They're all just graphite pencil, just a single mechanical pencil, and some knowledge of anatomy and form. I'm going to leave it there for technique and draftsmanship, and then we're going to get to the final one that is the most important. How are we doing? Gosh, I'm 40-some minutes into this. How are you all doing? I'm going to look at the chat for a moment.
The chat is all quiet. We're listening.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll still pause for half a minute just to gather my thoughts, because I'm going to take you now to the biggest part of this. The reason we're here. Oh, well, thank you, you all. I'm looking at the chat, which I have on a screen up there. Julia says, I'm still processing. Christian will make this available to you in time. Give us a couple weeks. Okay, technique, how the artist applies a medium. Drafting, how to control the illusion of 3D. Is it necessary? It is not necessary, especially in a world of 3D. Van Gogh was not a great draftsman. Joseph Vacal was not a great draftsman. There were a number of great artists who were not great at perspective and anatomy and rendering, but they knew this next thing, whether they got it from school or whether they just had it in their instincts, like some musicians do. Composition. Let's throw out a synonym. Design means almost exactly the same thing. But we don't use the word design here because design has connotations of graphic design. or character design or production design. There are too many jobs, official professions where the word design is part of it. And so it starts to lock it down to that. So we get up above it and say, let's call it composition, which means putting things together, making one thing out of many. It's the opposite of decomposing. It's to put things together. There's another very good word that's not complete, but we'll call it arrangement. The reason arrangement isn't a perfect fit is that arrangement assumes that something already exists and we're arranging it. When you arrange flowers, you didn't create the flowers. With composition, there's an assumption that you're coming up with the flowers and coming up with their arrangement. That if you're creating a painting, that you're coming up with the subject matter and the elements, and then you are arranging them. You're coming up with the ideas. So we can divide composition into origination and arrangement, coming up with ideas and then organizing them. That's another good word, organizing. Frank Zappa liked that one for composing. He said that's what composing music is. It's organizing. Yeah, but it's also coming up with the tunes, coming up with the rhythms, coming up with which parts will be harmonic and which parts will not. Okay, here's the big deal. Composition is based on creative choices. You can be creative with your technique, but technique is not inherently creative. When you teach someone pen and ink, watercolor, oil painting, acrylic, gouache techniques, you may, with a child, say, just experiment around with it. With a beginner, say, experiment around with it, because experimenting around with it can lead to some interesting mold-breaking approaches. But is that all that you would give the child or the student? Wouldn't you at some point teach them that there is such a thing as hatching and cross-hatching and thick to thin lines in single strokes that happen because you press down harder on the pen, and that some strokes go with the form like this and other strokes go across the form like this? Wouldn't you do that so that the student who's trying to master technique would understand the traditions and the skills that are not creative, they're technical? And with drafting, you can be brilliantly creative with breaking the rules of these things. M.C. Escher was famous for playing with perspective creatively, but is that the way you'd learn it? You'd learn drafting by understanding the truth about anatomy and perspective and rendering, the logic, before getting creative. But composition, which is in some ways the most impossible to teach, because the answer to how do you do it is you decide. Well, how do I know whether to make it darker or lighter? What do you think works best? Well, how do I know whether to make it bigger or smaller? It's your choice. Well, how do I know whether to make the edges soft or hard, and whether to have the person facing the camera or turning away? It's up to you. Well, then what are you going to give me to help? Hey, there are some people who, when they make decisions about how to compose, they make better choices than others. I have taught composition for almost 40 years. And I've seen that it's like with musicians. Some people come up with good tunes for songs and know how to make them a catchy song. Others don't. So you say it's just talent? No, it isn't just talent. I'm going to try to do my best to say, how do we learn this? The first thing we do is we look at great artists who are masters of composition, and we admire, we adore, we envy, we gasp. When I look at John Singer Sargent's arrangement of light and dark and warms and cools, which this is primarily warms, but some warms are less warm. When I look at his knowledge of color and technique, very little drafting in there. It's treated almost like graphic design. There is light on form, but all of his concern is for how the whole picture comes together to give a mood. And to envy that. Oh, John Singer Sargent, what beautiful work. Joseph Mallard William Turner. It's too many names. It shouldn't do that, but he got away with it. JMW. That is a beautiful arrangement of paint on a surface that you could have another artist who has the same set of paints who would not have it in them to do that. I want you to see these as examples, not of drafting, not even of technique. Turner's technique is very loose, expressive. I'm told that he used oil or watercolor sometimes like oil paint, where he out of the tube, opaque, and slosh it around. N.C. Wyeth, Newell Converse Wyeth, an American illustrator from the U.S., didn't like to travel, lived up in the northeast, and northeast, and he loved European subjects, but he had no interest in going to Europe. Felt like he had enough to pull from where he lived, and his strength. He has several strengths. One is knowing which part of the story to tell, which he said is an art in itself. But if you shrink these things down to the size of a postage stamp, they still work as compositions. Let's take this one here and blow it up big. Is somebody drawing on the screen? If you are drawing on the screen, don't draw on the screen. The oil painting technique, the light on form. He was famous for not using models. He made up his characters very often. One of his kids mentioned that. There's rendering in there. Oh, he's very aware of that form, but the whole thing sort of flattens out to where the silhouettes and the shapes, the language of design, so different from another artist. Now, you may know of Simplicissimus. You may know of Jugend. These are magazines that were published in Germany in the early 20th century, 1930s and previous. And George Pratt introduced me to these. And I am using them as an example here, where drafting and perspective and even light on form is almost dispensed with. It's almost not even there. There is over here, but those designers, as a lot of 20th century designers did, they decided that they liked the graphic design look, but what great compositions. and the variety within them. These are nothing like John Singer Sargent. But are they great? Yeah, different styles. But there's something going on with these artists that they know where to put things, how to treat it, whether to put outlines around it, whether to lose the outlines, whether to make it dark, light, in contrast, or blending in, calling your attention to one part or another. All the stuff, even the choice of medium that is creative, how you pop something out of a background by making it lighter against darker. But if a student who is not creative says, I got it, I got what composition is, it's popping things out. No, it's not that. Sometimes it's making things blend in so that it arouses curiosity. There's something going on in the shadows. I can't quite see it. I see it. Composition is strategy. It will be different for every problem, which is almost the definition of what a creative solution is. Not the same solution. Got a new problem? We're going to come up with a solution that solves this problem for this picture, for what emotion I'm going for what I want the audience to see or not see, for how I want them to respond to it. This is what composition is about. Design, arrangement. I'm going to look at the chat. How many of you knew about Simplicissimus and Jugend? Put in the chat. I want to see if there's a bunch of little click, 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 click. Yep. Julia didn't. Johanna did. Yes. Oh, yeah. Look at that. Yeah. A number of you did. Some of you didn't. Oh, gosh. You've got 100 examples right there of great compositions that are completely different from another set of examples. Look at those marvelous pieces, all by the same artist, who I think was a tragic story, that his life was so unpleasant, that his lack of sales were so bothersome, and that his stuff ended up selling for some of the most that any paintings in history ever sold for. What a brilliant composer. All right, I'm kind of done with this lecture on mastering picture making, taking all of those different things and trying to group them into 3 big clusters to make the point that to master composition means that you do the work of how it should be. And if you are lost on, but how can I get help with that? We're going to talk more about it in the next. See, we'll take a little break here so that I can make sure my slides are all intact. We'll answer some of your questions that you submitted in writing to Christian. But let me pause for a moment in case there's anything that I have neglected in this lecture that I can take up in the second half of it or fix right now. How are you all doing?
I think we're fine. We have a question from Ingrid.
Go ahead.
I think you need to put on your microphone. We don't hear you.
Ingrid, we're eager to hear you.
I think we lost her.
Okay.
That's too bad.
Well, if Ingrid can give it to you in
just
writing.
pressed the wrong button. I didn't want to ask something.
Ah,
Okay, we're halfway. Should we take 5 minutes as a break?
we can do
And then
that.
come back here and carry through. All right.
Yeah.
See you in 5. We'll start in about a minute. Marshall, have you read The Living Craft book by Tad Spurgeon? And if you did, would you? I have not read it, and I didn't even know about it, but I'm going to write it down. And this is from Anna Moshak recommends Living Craft. Tad Spurgeon. I'm excited about this, Christian. There's so many people here. This is got a thing going here, cross-continental.
Yes, I'm also very, very excited. We're about 140, I think, right now.
Wow, great. All right.
Yes, and I'm so glad that we got it together.
Yeah. Okay, why don't we start up? Now, again, brace your eyes. We're going to go back to this placard. A lot of questions about AI. I'll end on that. But the main thing I'm going to plead is ignorance. It's been a major topic of conversation in the last year. And we did a podcast on it. And what do I think? I don't know what to think. I do know one thing. Things are changing. Huge change ahead. That's the only thing I'm sure of. But see, look up here. When technique no longer became the way you made your living because the computer would do it, that changed things. When 3D came in, that changed things. Now, whatever you think of AI, it's got some really, really impressive composition skills. But the criticisms of it is still not making decisions that are based on what humans will ultimately care about. But we don't know where this is going to go. And I've been trying to find analogies about how technique and draftsmanship versus composition relate to the coming changes. Do we throw out technique because the computer can do it better? No. In fact, there's something called high-tech, high-touch that I think the guy who wrote Megatrends back in the 80s talked about, that the higher tech we get, the more we need to garden and work with watercolor and that kind of thing. You do it because you want to. Do we throw out learning perspective and anatomy and rendering? You can. For your profession? Sure, but is that what you want to do? We don't know how that's going to work. But when it comes to composition, if there's anything that is more distinctly human, it is this one. And it may be that the computer will take that over too. But this is more adaptable because it relates to writing. In fact, when you look up, years ago when I was trying to learn composition, when I'd look it up at the library, it would be all books about composing essays. And of course, musicians who originate the music are called composers. And some of them who take it to the next level are arrangers. So I don't know, but I'll get to that. Let's start with this question. Are there layouts that are related to each other? Well, of course. And when you go to many a book, Edgar Payne's famous book, one of the things that he tries to do in teaching composition is to show you that you can reduce the basic design of a picture to a basic design. This is useful the way knowing that a sonata has 3 or 4 movements, and that the movements are arranged to the fast one and the slow one, and then the final one that's fast again. And Andrew Loomis even shows that a composition may be based on letters and symbols. Well, how useful is that? Well, letters and symbols in any language evolved. There came a point where you wanted to make it so that they wouldn't be confused with each other. And the simpler you can make them, or the more complete you can make them, we didn't make these up in the 21st century. They were handed down to us through thousands of years of alphabets. And so to use them as bases for a composition is a bit like saying Beethoven's Fifth Symphony has these movements, and there's this first part that's aggressive, and this next part that's lyrical, and this third part that kind of a battle between them, and the fourth part that overlaps them and brings them together. And all that is useful in studying music composition in the way that it's useful to study the basic layout of a picture. So yes, there are lots of compositions, layouts that are related to each other on a basic level, and you can choose your favorite letter forms or your favorite shapes and relationships in nature. Some people don't like straight lines. Some people like curved lines so much that they don't even include straight lines, and their work might look noodly. Some people like straight lines so much that they need some noodly lines in there to soften the spikes that you can feel in their design. But it's a choice, and here's what I want to say about it. All those letters and symbols and basic layouts give you is a basic layout. You've still got a lot of other decisions to make. Every element in the picture, the angles of the lines, the straighter curvedness of the lines, the shapes that the lines make, aggressive shapes and passive shapes and organic shapes and industrial shapes, the lights and the darks, and that some of them will have dark darks, and some of them you would never let anything that dark happen in there. And others will have bright lights, and others you would never want anything that bright in there. You soften it. And textures, most of these are thickly textured, and you can see it even on the postage stamp level. But any of those that have texture in them, also probably in the originals, you'll see they'll have some where they have softer texture. My goodness, everything, warms, cools, brights, dulls, thick space, flat space, every element is in the hands of the artist making decisions. Compare. compare. Look at the variety of composition up there. Look at how flat. Look at how thick and three-dimensional. Understated. Hardly any personality visible in the small positions. Understated and overstated. Now, I'm going to brace your eyes. I'm going to go back to the question because there was more to the question. Are there layouts that are related to each other? Yes. For instance, when I'm realizing my layout does not work or I need a wider perspective, different focus point. In that case, what options and workarounds do I have? I have an answer for you. You may not be happy about it. It's one of those things that's like, how do you become a great musician? And the answer is you got to work. But here's how here's what options and workarounds you have. Thumbnail. When you're trying to solve a problem for a picture, look at what my student Mittel did. Each one of those might be a minute or 5, not more than 10 minutes. But the first stage, the first major stage in creativity, if you divide creativity into only 2 stages, the first stage is exactly what you asked about, options. Mittel is saying it could be this way, 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 it could be this way. And if you say it's so hard to do that, there's a good chance you're not a composer. There's a good chance you could have great value as with technical skill. But if this is threatening to you, the energy of composers, in my observation, is the energy of, I'll try it another way, I'll try it another way, I'll try it another way. I did it close up, I'll get far back. Put them in the upper left, I'll put them in the lower right. And that this is not a burden. This is play. Creative people like to do this. It's a major polarity in the Carl Jung, Myers-Briggs, David Keirsey temperament polarities, of those 4 polarities, the prober or perceiver versus judge or closer. Try it, try it, try it, try it. There's the first thing. Look at what Phoenix does in working out. None of those is a big commitment. Every one of them is an option. So my first advice to you is thumbnail, thumbnail, thumbnail. And I'm going to carry through. I've got more to say on this. Some of you ask about resources and games and that kind of thing. And it's really hard in a small amount of time to point you to resources because there's so many of them. But there is a course that I'm not necessarily recommending. It's from the great courses, the Creative Thinker's Toolkit, Gerard Puccio, and 24 lectures. Each one of them is about a half hour. I've listened to this course over and over and over and over and over and over and over to where I just kind of know it inside and out. I listened to it years after I knew pretty much everything in here from other books. The thing that's interesting about the way he does it is that this course on creativity is surprisingly not that creative. It is a scholarly representation of what a lot of research shows. What do we know about creativity from research? And one thing that everybody knows is that research has to do with creativity has not just to do with hierarchical thinking, like the outlines that we learn. It also has to do with side-to-side thinking. Now, that term has been coined by Edward de Bono, who I'll mention. In fact, that was his first book that I read, Edward de Bono's Lateral Thinking. I'll show you that name later. It means that one thing is related to another, is related to another, is related to another. It's creative thinking. Look at what else he has in this course. Diverge, then converge. It was a part of my midlife crisis. I was always converging too soon. Diverge first. What does it mean? Well, let's take this slide that is credited by the person who did it. Divergent thinking is to options, 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 options. How many different things? And then to switch into convergent thinking, narrow it down. This is to be the kid. Try it every way you can. This is to be the grown-up. It says we're running out of time. The question leading to all sorts of ideas is divergent thinking. If that's all you do, you never ship product. Convergent thinking is to take all the options and say, here is the answer. And if that's all you do, you'll ship product, but it will not be what it could be if you'd taken time to do the other thing. Diverge and converge, stages of the creative process, of course. Creativity does not happen in one swoop any more than the evolution of a human being happens in one swoop. It happens in stages. And brainstorming is a part of that diverging. And look at how somewhere in here, evaluating. That means judging. That's that other side of the polarity. Closure, making decisions to lock it down. Diverge, then converge. When I'm working, I'm realizing it's not working. I need something different. All right. Try this, try that, try the other. How though? First, we got to be sure that you're committed. Not one way, a dozen ways. You enjoy that? Good, you're on your way. You don't need a teacher. You'll teach yourself. Now, just this year, one of my students, Anna Malek, I got to spend 6 months with her in the last part of the year with a perspective course with a wonderful group. We've kept in touch, and she told me that Andrew Huberman, who's become famous in this last year with a really popular podcast, had a podcast that's over 2 hours on creativity. I don't have time to watch it. Well, she gave me a wonderful breakdown of it, and I listened to 10 minutes, and then I listened to another 15 minutes, and over a period of a couple of weeks, I listened to the whole thing. And you know what the big theme of this was? The bulk of his scientific research, the science of creativity and how to enhance creative innovation, was mainly about diverge and converge. This is something there's no question about. But what he talked about is what happens in the brain chemically in these two experiences. If you're interested in that, there's a lot in there. I'm not recommending it necessarily. I don't know that this podcast is going to make you more creative, but if you're interested in the science of it, dopamine levels, particular pathways, synapses. Okay, great. He only spent 20 minutes or so of that 2 hours and 16 minutes on the second issue, which is a whole other paradigm. It's creativity as story. Let me see if I can summarize. Story has some components. Story has context. That's a setting. Story has characters, more than one character typically, and more than one character means more than one point of view. Different angles to what's going on in this story. Context, point of view, and then what's the third thing? Actions. People do things, get responses from others or from their setting. And those three components, characters and settings and actions, are core elements of storytelling, and they are also analogous to the creative process. The one we're talking about right now is multiple points of view. Now, let's go on to another question. What would be creative warm-up exercises? Well, I'm glad you asked. It depends on for what. This is context. This is in this world, in this underwater world. Some things are possible, some things aren't. In this dry desert world, some things are possible, some things aren't. Creative warm-up exercises for whom? For what skill? They'll be different for storytelling illustrators than for technical illustrators. If you're a storyteller, this month I have been hosting story sprints at Project City. And I'm really, really happy with the group of students that are paying their subscription there. They've got all sorts of industry, really impressive industry people teaching. I'm the one who isn't an industry person. I'm like an old dad that they brought in to host creative prompt sprints. And this month's theme has been mining your life for story material. That's an example of a creative warm-up exercise. But I want to, you're not in there, you're in here. I want to point out a great one is to start on a touchstone. What's that mean? I first heard the term from a man who he was my babysitter when I was a kid, and he and his wife made a fortune in TV writing in the 60s. And I asked him how he learned to write. And he told me that he started by reading someone's work and then getting a footing with that person's voice, that person's writing, and then writing his own work like that. Many people have said this. How did you go, Quentin Tarantino? Did you go to film school? No, I went to films. Start on a touchstone that you can touch down on solidly because you admire that work. And then kick off onto your own journey. It's not a grindstone. It's not a millstone. It's not something to bog you down. It's something to give you footing. In storytelling, we're trying to finish up this course by the end of the week. So it should be available on my Gumroad next week. We take 4 really, really well-crafted stories from the early seasons of The Simpsons, first 2 seasons, and we analyze them and see how masterfully they were put together. And if you have that part in you like a kid that says, wow, that was a great story. Look, I understand what they did with the fortune graph. I understand what they did with the plants and the payoffs. I understand what they did with the pointers that have me expecting things. And you get a little understanding of something as good as those 4 TV shows. Then you are starting with a touchstone and you say, I can do it like that. It means a masterpiece to get your footing. It's a great way to warm up. Bob Duncan, the writer I was referring to, warmed up each morning by reading Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy and then writing my novel as if I was Will Durant. I just wrote it like him. How do we do that with picture making? Well, I assign it. You take masterpieces and you understand them analytically by breaking them into design components. That's the analytical part of the brain. It's quite technical. It's not necessarily creative. But it feeds your awareness of the picture so that you too can understand what's going on with composition. But look at what else is in here. It's like a wave hitting a lighthouse. It's like paint splattered on a wall. This Alphonse Mucha is like a slept-in bed. like a snow globe, like rocks falling. There's no rocks falling in there, but the design itself feels that way. This Winslow Homer, a cake that someone started eating with their hands. We've moved away from technical into the kind of things that a child does in their unbridled, naive creativity. We've turned toward analogies, metaphor, a primary component in creativity, lateral thinking. Look up there at what Mittel did. He's analyzing it for curves and straights, for curves one way and curves another way, but he's also making observations. And I have students compare to more than one thing: jaws closing on prey, a snake on a chessboard, a baleful eye looking up from inside a well or a pit. Liken the image to another thing, and that is specifically creative warm-up. Let's go back to that, creative warm-up. Now, here's what I have you do if you study composition with me for a month or 4. Eat a picture a day, choose worthy meals, savor them, enjoy them. You want to be a songwriter? Johnny Cash's daughter wanted to be a songwriter. Oh, he jumped on that. 100 country music songs. You're going to listen to all of these songs. You're going to get to know them. That's your first job. You could have said 1. Ooh, that wouldn't have been a good idea. At least 3 of variety, so you can see a song can be many things. What about 20? What about 100? Could you imagine if you really knew those pictures? Winslow Homer and N.C. Wyeth have a lot in common. Very different from Hokusai. Hokusai very different from Hopper, and yet they're all working with the same ingredients, arranging them differently. Can you imagine if you were to get to know 20, 30, 40, 50, 100? If we were going to study together for 4 months, you do 100, where you would analyze them, understand them, and liken them to other things. Eat a picture a day, choose worthy meals, savor them, enjoy them, and do you know small time-effective practices for pictures composition? Yeah, thumbnail. I've mentioned that. But I want to get a little critical here. A small time-effective practice. Shortcuts lead to nasty places. Go to the great creatives that you admire and listen to what they say about their work. And somewhere in there, you are going to hear about how rough the job is. They love the job, but it is so challenging to not just do the same thing over and over. Careful of this. I am going to answer it. I've already started to. Shortcuts lead to nasty places. Just a reality check here. Look at those covers of Jugend. There is not a cover up there that, look at the variety up there. Look at the marvelous, I'm going to do it another way, going to do it another way, going to do it another way. And I think it's safe to say that any one of those is good. Some of them might not hold up as well as others. Some of them hold up marvelously. I know there's some repeats up there. I think it's safe to say that every one of them somebody labored over. There may have been some that came out quickly and easily. It's like having babies. Every labor is different, but it is called labor for a reason. So let's be aware of that. And here's the answer. Nicolaides' Daily Composition is the best answer that I know. Whatever you think of his book, I'm tired of hearing people's opinions of his book, especially from people who don't know his book. His book is flawed, but there it is. In the US, thrift stores were full of this book. Everybody bought this book and said, I don't want this book, and gave it to thrift store, so you could always buy it for 10 cents. But it has some great exercises in it, including exercise 14. Exercise 14 is the daily composition, and I won't read this whole thing through. It's got other good compositions in there too, but essentially it is draw a picture a day. And here are some qualifications from memory, not one that you just make up. You're trying to exercise your memory. That is a specific requirement. You say, is that all you should do? No, you can draw from imagination too, but for this exercise, we're trying to work a muscle of observing and then not looking, but remembering. And every day, students getting in the habit of it, accountable that each week, no more than 15 minutes on these. Oh, I'd like to spend more. Then you're not getting the exercise. They can be done in 5 or 10 minutes, but not more than 15. Nicolaides had a reason for that. And Jessica Nguyen, who had turned into an incredible illustrator, just amazing, amazing skill. I got to teach her for whatever it was, 2 or 3 years at the junior college. She embraced this, and I'm suggesting that you draw a picture a day from memory, 15 minutes or less, and feel free to do it poorly. It's not to make a good picture, it's just to exercise. Eventually, the part in you that wants to make a good picture starts to kick in, but it kicks in over a period of months. And you're developing now not your analytical skills and your creative skills in response to a masterpiece, but doing your own lousy memory drawings and starting to enjoy doing them and learning some lessons from those masterpieces and saying, I think I'll try it in mine. And now you're off and running, and you do not need me or any other teacher, but you may want to have some friends around, because people start having opinions. Gosh, I can't stand it when they do that stuff. Oh, isn't that cool the way? Oh, I love that. And this becomes food and exercise. And you don't need to have children exercise if you just give them recess, and if they haven't been contaminated with their tablets and smartphones. They will go out and climb trees and fight and chase and wrestle and do all the other things. Food and recess lead to growth. Okay, I hope I've answered the question. I'm going to pause for a moment, though, because we've got about 20 some minutes left. And I think I'm only going to do make one more little suggestion before I pause enough to see how we're doing. I've got several more questions from you that I want to get to, and I'll have to go through them fast. Finding ideas, quick rethinking of composition, change of perspective, light, dark contrasts, use of shadows. How do I achieve emotionality and tension? Well, those are two different things, but they are related. Tension in a picture prompts emotion. Oh, what was it? Curiosity. Well, how would you do this? Feel the emotion? Experiment till you make it exciting? Somebody else asked, How do I make out of a boring composition a very exciting one? I have a suggestion. Drew Struzan pointed out that you can't just feel happy feelings and draw a painting and expect it to work and make the viewer feel happy. Of course, that could contribute. But the proof is that you can feel happy and draw a picture that doesn't make another person feel happy. It just makes them feel confused. There is a skill involved in here. And I think that the skill comes out of that exercise of likening a picture to another thing. But if you've got two people having a conversation at dinner and you want it to feel comforting, you could treat the color scheme and the shapes like a cozy bed. You want it to feel burgeoning and alive. You could treat the color scheme and the shapes like a spring garden. You want it to feel poisonous. It's a bad relationship. You could treat the shapes and the color scheme like a scorpion or a poisonous frog. You get the idea? The inspiration from something that you consider exciting or emotional can make a huge difference. Albrecht Dürer, people have criticized his compositions because they are clunky and awkward. They are. They're crowded. They're lowbrow. They're like graffiti or other lowbrow art. That's one way to look at them. But there's an appeal to them. There was an appeal to them when I was a kid because they were like opening a drawer full of junk, full of utensils. It's, oh, wow, I'm going to dig around in there. That's metaphor. When you compare them to an artist he had a powerful influence on, Arthur Rackham. I'm sorry, I don't have the names on there. Look at Arthur Rackham's compositions. I don't think they don't feel like junk drawers to me. They feel like stains on a wall. They flow more. You're getting the idea. Liken the work to something that feels that way. Now, I don't have time to elaborate, but I elaborated in this podcast, How to Learn Composition, Draftsman Season 2, Episode 15. I elaborated on it to Stan, and people liked it, and I take it further. But I will tell you, I have had students who pay no attention to this. They just write down the notes and say, Marshall said you should look at pictures metaphorically, and that's interesting, but I don't hear other books telling me that. You're on the wrong track. Metaphor goes back as far as human consciousness knows to liken things to others. And I've seen other students. Chris Applehans is an example. Vance Kovacs, Justin Sweet, Jeff Kruger, a number of them who've just done remarkable work. And they have learned that metaphor is a skill. It's something you practice. It's something that every day, 2 or 3 times, you look at things and liken them to other things like a child does. Chris, who went from a nobody to a person who did one of Netflix's most popular, he wrote the script and directed the film, and we interviewed him on the podcast. He was someone who really took this seriously, that one thing is like another. Liken your picture to something else. And it can even be something as simple as a yin-yang symbol, a light area with important dark parts, a dark area with important lighter parts, but not exactly like a yin-yang symbol. We're breaking things into opposites. Vance Kovacs, just really, when he and Justin were students, they ran with this. They played their pictures so often to see how they could treat the design secretly like something else. Okay. Based on creative choices, composition. Composition comes from you, not from your teacher or a book, and the things that you like to look at, the things that you have on your bookshelf. In a longer composition course, I would have you collect inspirations, particularly from nature. They don't have to be from nature. One of my students did great work, and she loved, for whatever reason, she loved motorcycle engines and machinery with a lot of complex tubes, all of that stuff that evolved for function that ends up being fascinating form. And it's not that she's doing pictures of machinery. She may be doing pictures of cities or bedrooms, but treats them like machinery. The power of metaphor is one aspect of creativity. That is, I think, in answer to your question, the best I can do of how do you and how do I make it one feeling or another. Find something in the world that feels that way and use it as an inspiration for how to abstractly treat your picture. Do you think there are still very original concepts of design out there? I don't know who wrote this, but do you think that there aren't? Dear student, absolutely. There always have been. There always will be. True, popular music goes through sometimes a decade of crap, not all crap. There's always good popular music. But when you can see that 80, 90% of it in the late 19th century, 80 to 90% of it in the 1950s or so, maybe 80, 90% of it now for the mainstream popular music. But what happens is that some young person breaks out of it and becomes original by taking stuff nobody else knows. They just steal from the past and they put it together in new ways. There's a whole book called Hitmakers where he analyzes it in those terms of fluency and disfluency. But I want to, since you're asking, are there still very original concepts to design out there? This is a book that I'm not recommending to you. I read it when it came out in the 90s. It's a big, long book of scientific research or psychological research on creative people. And they went after 100 great domain changers, people who changed their industries, changed science, changed the arts, changed some profession to see what they had in common. Unfortunately, they didn't find many things in common. Creative people are creative people, and they've got all sorts of diversity within them. But the advantage of reading a book like that is that you become aware that there are people who will be original. I hope you will. I hope that even the time that you've taken to be here on a Tuesday evening reveals that you care about this enough to put your mind around it. Study those who innovate. I didn't know most of the people in Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's book. And I was in my 30s when I read it. And parts of it were discomforting. I've been a student of people who innovated since I was a young person. I fell in love with the Beatles. I fell in love with the Marx Brothers. I fell in love with the Three Stooges. I fell in love with all sorts of things on TV from the US and fell in love with old artists like Dürer, fell in love with Mad Magazine artists. And I wanted to know everything I could about them to know how did they do it. This is the way. You find the people who make a difference and you look at their lives and you look at your own and you see how you're different and how you're similar. And sometimes how you're different may be your strength. Let's see here. I think in the interest of time, we need to move on. Do you have ideas, concepts on how I can enhance? I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop for a moment. I want to go back here. This may be the one of the last lessons that I'm going to give about creativity. I'll send you to some resources in a few minutes. Dr. Eric Rabkin, who I admire very much, did a course on fantasy and science fiction for the great courses that I listened to over and over. I reached out to him when I taught a genre class, and I got him to be a guest speaker. He knows as much about science fiction and fantasy literature and history as anyone on the planet. And he had headed up in 1998, he started the Genre Evolution Project about how genres evolve. And they found several factors. They published the research in 2005. And I'm going to tell you from memory what I remember about it. One way that genres evolve, they studied science fiction as a genre because there's so much documentation how it evolved in the 20th century. One way it evolves is the inner logic of the genre. The genre itself needs something. My example is Superman did not have kryptonite till somebody realized you got to have something. He can fall in love with Lois Lane. That makes him vulnerable, but there's got to be something to make him vulnerable. Kryptonite, Superman needed kryptonite. Another is changed historical circumstances. Science fiction itself emerged out of a world that everything is changing because of science. So now it's not magic, it's explainable. And our lives change so dramatically because of technology that there need to be stories about the effect of technology. Changed historical circumstances is another thing. Right now, it's gender and race issues very much are a part of evolving genres. Here's another, fusions. Fusions of more than one genre. Obviously, that's how life happens, through fusions. Back to the Future is science fiction, but it's also a romantic comedy, and it's also action adventure. Galaxy Quest adds parody. Genres evolve through fusions, but here's the one that's most important. Genres evolve because of individual genius. I'm teaching genre, and I love teaching genre because my appeal is, what is it that you're going to bring to the genre that your Wikipedia entry 20 years from now will say the history of this genre was changed in the 2020s or 2030s by you, insert your name, because you did this, and this will come from looking at the genre and saying, hey, I can do better than the grown-ups. It's audacious, but I think that is a spirit that brings about original concepts. Study those who innovate and then go and do likewise. Okay, quickly. You have ideas, concepts on how I can enhance my speed in drawing. Yes. The 8-minute draw. This comes from a book by Ivan Brunetti, Cartooning, Philosophy and Practice. I don't even know that he called it the 8-minute draw, but I do know it's the first exercise in there. Is you take something that you put a timer on, draw it for 4 minutes, then 2 minutes, then 1 minute, then 30 seconds, then 15 seconds, and 5 seconds. For years, I had always done gesture drawings first and then went to the longer drawing in life drawing classes when I used to teach life drawing. That's how we always start. It's a good way to start. But I found out that when you do it in reverse order, take anything, it can be a machine, it can be a house, it can be an interior, it can be a food plate, it can be a tree. Put on your timer for 4 minutes, draw it however you like, then half that, then half that, then half that, then half that, then try doing it in 5 seconds. And when you do this with a group, when you get down to the 30-second, 15-second, 5-second one, the group starts giggling. It's the annotation. We're going to try to draw the whole tree in 5 seconds. Yeah. There has to be an acceptance that it might not be a good drawing, but that's okay. That was an answer to your question. Can I enhance my speed in my drawing? If you didn't know about that, I liked this book, by the way, for creativity exercises, particularly for cartoonists. But I don't have time to elaborate. I'm a graphic recorder, and sometimes my client does not deliver as much content as I thought. So I have to fill up my space versus too much content, and I have to make up space. I have two responses. If your client does that, you can blame your client. There are bad clients. When my son was about 12 or 13 years old, he got his first job tutoring a kid a year or two younger who was having trouble in school. And the kid was impossible. And one time I was in the living room with my son and the phone rang, and it was for him. It was the kid's mom. And I could hear over the phone, I could hear, and he was pacing around listening. And when he hung up the phone, he turned to me and said, "She fired me." And I thought, okay, this is his first job. This could really be damaging. And I was going to give him a speech. And he said, "She was a bad client." Well, the son was much smarter than the father. I used to, when I had bad clients, figure it was always my fault. It may be your client's fault, but there's another alternative. Or take advantage of it. Sometimes a bad relationship can give you navigating skills. Sometimes being in the arena with a bull gets you really good at dodging and creative distracting. Some innovative people will say, "I've got a problem here, but hey, if I've got to do this, watch me solve the problem. If I've got to do this, I'm going to do." One of the great innovators in comics in the 1950s was Bill Elder. He did Mad Comics for Harvey Kurtzman, and everything he did, he added little gags in there. He loved to fill the page with little gags. Not that Harvey wrote, but that Bill came up with. He became known for that. Sometimes a limitation to a creative person, you brainstorm, how could I use this to my advantage? Or you get out of the relationship. Sorry for giving great big therapeutic fatherly advice, but we're here to talk about creativity, and it may be that that's something good. What must a portfolio of concept art contain in order to be considered complete? It so depends. It depends on the client. Concept art for who? Could have opposite portfolios, one that show you only do one kind of thing, one that show you do all sorts of kind of things. How do I enter character design concept art? How can a newcomer to concept art break into the industry, especially if they're only 2D and not yet 3D? It's not a question that I can answer specifically by telling you go to Insomniac, or go to Riot, or go to Obsidian. They need a 2D artist. I can't tell you that. I can only give you big maxims like do work that excites employers and get it in front of them somehow, lawfully. Don't show up on their front door. Don't offend them. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that? There's all sorts of ways. You would know more about it than I do at this point. I'm not seeking those jobs, but I've watched many students get those jobs, and they happen all sorts of ways. Now, another one, how is the average order situation as a freelancer within concept art? Is there a rough outline to design prices in the field of concept art? Here's where I want to point you. Here's a place to start. There's much more beyond this. Go to our podcast. We interviewed 4 concept artists who are happening in the industry, 3 of whom were my students, who I'm proud of. When you ask, is it difficult? It is difficult to receive concept art commissions from the USA because of visa applications. Not every studio is willing to take those on for the artist. Do I have to apply for a working visa myself, or is there anything else I can do? I have no knowledge. But Jama Jurabayev was one of my students in an online school He's in Tajikistan, where there was no industry, and he was so good. He got employed in the UK, and I interviewed him. So you've got him telling his story. But I will say, in response to this, sometimes when a door is closed, you just may go through, may go another direction. I did not work for ad agencies in LA, or very little. I did some, but very little, because it was too long a drive for me. It's an hour and a half drive. In traffic, it can be 2 hours. And so there were Orange County ad agencies that I could work for them. I didn't go to art school because I couldn't afford to, but I essentially got it another way. This is the age of IPs, intellectual properties, and independent creatives. And there may be other ways, but I can't answer, but I can say, listen to those who've done it. I'd like to know whether it is reasonable pursuit to try and aim to work for a specific company. Yes, it is. It is a reasonable pursuit. Or if it's smarter decision, just follow your own art path and hope that your style, interests, and proficiencies matches a company that will then reach out to you. It happens both ways. Another one of you asked, how do I get hired as an illustrator by Disney? You're going to have to ask the people who hire. One of my former students has been their main recruiter for years. I've had lots of students who work for Disney because I live in Southern California. I've worked for a number of the Disney entities. How do you get hired as an illustrator? It's back to the same answer as before. You do something Disney wants, and they want it so much that they will hire you, but you're going to have to network in that world. There is some reasonable reason to pursue a specific company. Sometimes companies like that because they can take advantage of you. It's like a person who wants to be married to you too much. And the power shift can become imbalanced. But it does happen that childhood ambitions to work for a company come true. But we talked about that a bit on the podcast. As an artist, how do you find a balance between allowing your creative energy to flow while having to respond to the requirements of a stressful environment with lots of deadlines? Oh, you have my empathy, my sympathy, and my life has been filled with it, and it's still not there. I still have trouble with it. So it's hard for me to answer that. Do you have any tips and career advice for artists who have very diverse interests in areas of work in the visual arts? It's often said you should specialize, but that doesn't feel right to me. Again, both. There's no easy answer on that. I'm going to point you in a direction in a moment. Concept art is changing. What will AI do? How do you see the future of concept art in the age of AI? How do you profitable when AI will become even better? For decades, you've worked as an illustrator, and things are dead right now, and work is harder and harder. I can't say much. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. But I said as much as I had to say in this podcast, which came out the week that the legal controversies exploded. And gosh, we've had over 100,000 views on that. They all tapered off as soon as all of the controversy happened. But you know what I said in there, as a person who doesn't use AI, as an outsider, I feel like I had at least one good thing to say about attitudes toward it. So if you want pretty much everything I've had to say about it, I'm trying to bow out of the conversation right now. It's there, it's recorded, it's free. Couple more quickly. Do you know strategies on how to improve your creativity? What about games and meditation? Yes, too many to list. I will tell you that when I was about 19 or 20, I started checking out every book from the library and reading every book I could on creativity. There can come a point where you read too many. There comes a point where study is one thing and applying it is another. We did 3 podcasts on creativity, actually 4. There's one on solving creative blocks, another on enhancing, one on my favorite book on creativity, absolutely my favorite, is Gabriel Rico's Writing the Natural Way. I did a whole podcast reporting to Stan on, can this book on writing, can artists use this book on writing? I love her book. In fact, I discovered her book in my early 30s, and it was so influential on me. And it was a pivotal point for practical creativity, like no other source that I had, other very valuable sources, that when I revisited it a year or two ago to report to Stan, I loved it all over again. I fell in love with it all over. I read through it twice slowly again. It's my favorite. Doesn't mean it'll be your favorite. But let me tell you what the problem was with loving that book so much. I discovered it in my early 30s, and I liked it so much that I thought, I don't need it anymore. This will keep me busy for a lifetime or 5. And I did read Edward de Bono's Lateral Thinking and de Bono's Thinking Course, but I did not read his 6 Thinking Hats. I looked at it. I gave it maybe 10 or 20 minutes of attention, but I wish I'd given it more attention, because one of the problems that happens is that we have more than one kind of thinking. And when we try to apply logical thinking to creative problems, we are using the wrong tool. When we try to apply creativity to hard logic problems, we are using the wrong tool. When we go with our gut for something that is a programming issue, we are using the wrong tool. We have different modes of thinking, and de Bono very thoughtfully turned them into one of the most valuable ones for me, because I've been terrible at context in my life. But the blue hat is one that I've tried to nurture, to see the whole picture and how it relates together, to worry about the whole outline and not the specifics. I was so detail-oriented, I'd lose context. The white hat of just cold-blooded facts. The red hat of pure gut-level intuition. The green hat of lateral thinking. The positive hat of sunshiny day, everything's going to great, we're going to be millionaires and it's going to be. The black hat of wait just a moment there, kid, that's dangerous. The purple hat is the money hat, the one who has the power. I did a short report on it in one of our podcasts, and I recommend the 6 thinking hats if you are the kind of person who feels like I solve some problems well and not others. In fact, this book, The 6 Thinking Hats, is a blue hat book. It helps you get up over your thinking and see the different ways people think that you think. All right, we have to finish. I'm sorry, but games, exercises, lots and lots. If I get a chance to teach you in some course, I'll try to give you more, but that's there. We've gotten started. Now, if you want more from me, actually, let me see, Christian, yes. Have I neglected anything or?
I'm not sure, but I think we can have some more minutes. Jürgen, what do you think?
If there's anything that you feel is crucial, that I really missed something and we need to bring it up, because we've gone over time.
I think there will be no end to it, because it's so inspiring and encouraging listening to you. And we could do that for all day. But I think we have to find to finish it for now. So,
okay. Well, if you want more from me, I am available for cheap. We just started a Gumroad. I think this Heinrich Klei course, which is $32 in American dollars. You were in there, weren't you, Christian? Yeah.
Yes, it's worth it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we honed it down to recordings. We took out all the stuff that wasn't worth putting in there, and we added some extra things in. And if you will pay $32 for that course, I think you'll get more than your money's worth. I think he is one of the greatest draftspeople in the history of comic illustration. I'm just astonished by him. And when I taught the course, I could not believe how much more I loved him as I went. And everything I can give you in those 4 sessions, I give you in that. And you can help me by giving me passive income by buying it, not pirating it. And with the Bridgman course, you can get it for free on YouTube. But if you want to buy it so it won't have commercials and a little higher res, this very inexpensive design your career with a whiteboard thing has to do with some of the questions you all ask. If you want to work for a company, you put that company on your whiteboard and you look at it every day. It's an hour lecture that was boiled down from a live lecture that I gave. And it was the first thing that we put up on our website to sell that was recently produced. And it's the best I can give you in 1 hour for how a whiteboard can help you solve your own problems. I give you 4 or 5 metaphors, maybe more, for how you can use a whiteboard as a map, as a reverse journey, as a petri dish, etc. And then this is really old stuff. The linear perspective course from 1994. That's my online perspective course. I'm working on another one that I've been on forever. The reason I've been on it forever is that I need to make a living. And when I work on it, I don't make any money until it sells. And we had a little workshop back in 2015. If you help me by going to my Gumroad, spending money on me, it blesses my life, and it also enables me to produce more. We will have that storytelling lessons from The Simpsons up in, I hope, in 1 week. Okay, that's my advertisement. And marshallart.com is where most of my stuff is. Now it links over to the Gumroad. And I want to stop sharing now to thank you. Thank you for being here on Tuesday evening and spending this much time.
Thank you, Marshall, for spending this time with us. It's been a big pleasure. It's like a class with Marshall is like a walk with a salty breeze at the seaside after a hot day in the city. So to try to think in metaphors. So it's been a blast. Thank you so much. And we will put this up on YouTube in a couple of weeks, I think. So we will back and forth it between us. And it will be also available to revisit.
Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you again.
Yeah, Marshall, thank you for being here and spending the time and putting in the effort. It was really, if you look in the chat, that's where it was. It's amazing and it's encouraging and it's it really is inspiring. I felt mesmerized listening to you. It's really great. Thank you for your insight and your thoughts.
Thank you very much. See y'all again.